With funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, New Unity has transformed its Newington Green Meeting House into a fully accessible, free heritage space, showing its radical history and encouraging visitors to think differently. The building, which was a hotbed of revolutionary thinking in the 18th century, holds stories of Richard Price, Anna Letitia Barbauld, Andrew Pritchard, and most notably Mary Wollstonecraft, leading to it being described as the birthplace of British feminism. The Meeting House hosts a regular programme of events and exhibitions celebrating this history and serving its local community. Find out more online.
So this talk is about the title that we've chosen, Twice as Hard. That came up because we were discussing the realities of what brings everyone together, not just black people but even POC in general. The concept of always being told from our elders that you have to work twice as hard in order to achieve just even the bare minimum, especially if you're from an immigrant family moving to a European country or just simply existing within a European country. The restrictions and realities of what you face in comparison to people who are European whilst you're navigating whichever industry, you are always told the same thing. I think it's like a generational thing, like our parents were told it, we were told it, and I'm sure no matter how time goes on, we'll be sharing the same sentence to even our offsprings.
I think so, because in a way, our experiences will define how we'll teach the next generation, just as it has done for our parents' generation. I guess it's a tricky thing, because I think it's something that you navigate from very early on, how in which you're treated within institutions, whether that be the educational system or an institution of a working environment. I guess education is just kind of the practice space in which you get to kind of work out how in which you can still try to thrive within an environment that is not set up for you to thrive, which I think is where working twice as hard or 10 times as hard even comes from. It's so that you can somehow try and make what you can of a level playing field, even though there'll never exactly be one. But I think also what's quite interesting is in navigating in environments such as education and work institutions is that sometimes when you're treated differently is not even definable, because I think because of institutionalized racism, it's so insidious, and in the way in which society moves is that things aren't even necessarily tangible that you can see are obstacles for you.
No, I think you made a point as well, especially when it comes to the educational system. I think that's exactly when that concept of working twice as hard comes up, because I think in talking about personal experiences, even if when you're a pupil and you're going to school, you're always constantly, I recognise it, especially in my childhood, that the black kids were always singled out. Like if someone were to be speaking in class, it was always, you're being disruptive and if you're asking too many questions. Like I personally had that. My experience in school was more, don't get me wrong, I was talkative in my own right, but it was usually if your mind isn't stimulated, rather than it seen as maybe this child might be maybe an overachiever or they're achieving things at a higher level in comparison to other people, because then they feel their mind isn't stimulated, then they seem that they're disruptive, but really they just need to perhaps be put in a different group altogether that is more achieving things quicker, rather than being seen as disruptive. I think a lot of people have dealt with that, especially.
I think it's sometimes in that way as if you're treated like you're stupid or you're not intelligent, this can impact a child's ability to thrive regardless of the intellect they actually have. So I think that's why it's interesting when it comes to things like exams, because exams is when you can prove people wrong. And I think we know very well that we had it last year when people would be given, they were given grades because of COVID,
based on the area.
Based on the area and based on teachers' predictions, and it's a well-known fact that teachers always underestimate the achievements of black students.
No, I remember I was talking about it earlier about first hand, because my mother was a teacher, and she was one black teacher out of, well, now I can say it, but it was charter school in Dulwich, and that school is predominantly a very middle upper class school, though they will have people because of area code that they'll accept, even people from working class areas. It predominantly is a middle class, and she would be the only black teacher, and she would overhear other teachers, and some of them weren't even black, and they would state that majority of the black kids, they would always predict them to have lower grades, or they would always be seen as disruptive or seen as problematic, but then the moment she would walk in the room, they would go silent. So they knew themselves that they were saying things that were just unfortunate and negative stereotypes. So with that, the whole concept of COVID now dictating that people's teachers will now predict their future, it's blasphemy. It shouldn't happen, because quite frankly, even with my tutor when I was at uni, that was jumping from secondary school, she didn't understand me as a pupil. So then they can be the people who literally navigate or open doors or close doors for your future, and it's not fair for a teacher, one teacher at that, to be able to predict your future entirely based upon the relationship that you have with them, because as much as that teacher might see you as disruptive and try to predict you a low grade, what you actually are capable of achieving is something much greater than that. It's dangerous.
It really is, and it also comes in terms of choosing which categories to enter students into for their exams. If you're entered into like the lower tier and the maximum grades that you can get is like a grade C, well then that's defining your university opportunities before you've even had a chance to sit a test. The test is already saying you can only reach this high, and I think that's what it is. It's like sometimes it's a glass ceiling and you can't see it, but sometimes you can see that the ceiling is there and it's put in place for certain people to not really be able to move. I guess it's like people talk about like social mobility, but I guess in this society they don't really want to have much social mobility. You always get a handful of people who do manage to achieve and move through, but it's like, okay, we'll have a couple, but it's like we always say, it's like, you know, we're happy to have a token or one or two, but you don't want them all coming up at once. What would happen then?
No, it's true. But I think what was interesting is like the conversations that you and I have had talking about this topic, and even me speaking to other friends of colour, the concept of when you see that title twice as hard, automatically I think we all think about the struggle or the circumstances that are not, it's not equal in order for us to achieve a certain level in life. Even just to be stable, to have a stable income, to not want too much, just stability. The realities are, it's usually, people always assume it's based upon struggle, but I think with that we shouldn't always have this idea that it's a struggle narration. I think at the end of the day a lot of us don't necessarily come from that. As much as even I could hold my hands up and recognise that my experience is very different to the experiences of the people who I grew up with, because I grew up in Peckham, which is predominantly, now it's gentrified as hell, but when I was living there it was a very working class black neighbourhood. And though I grew up on a council estate, my mother then achieved her degree, became a teacher, and then quite quickly my environment and life completely changed. So in regards to classism, my concept of working twice as hard wasn't dependent on me having to do that in order to achieve certain things, because of the school that I went to was predominantly middle class, and there were middle class black kids, middle class Indian kids, middle to upper class, and because I then moved from a working class background to a middle upper class background, I then recognised that as much as I grew up in Peckham, I recognised my struggle was not the same as theirs. So the concept of twice as hard for me was more recognising that my mother had to work twice as hard in order to get from A to B, but for me it wasn't I have to work twice as hard in comparison to the white kid. It was just, it became my work ethic of recognising I had to do that.
But then I think also what like a key thing is like it's intersectionality, because intersectionality is thinking about race, it's thinking about class, it's talking about gender, and how these different things can overlap. Because I've had a couple of conversations with people within the working environment when it's kind of been that, okay, well, oh yeah, if you're black and a woman, but I come from a working class background, as if these things are comparative and measurable, and they're not. Like, all of these different elements play a part in terms of what opportunities you have or don't
100%,
have.
100%.
But at the end of the day, like, there is no level playing field for anybody, but race is a big factor, and then with gender and class on top of it, some people can end up having a lot more obstacles to fight against.
No, definitely, 100%. Because even if, for instance, if I think about my neighbourhood and where I grew up, the reason why I may have been given different opportunities is because of the environment that I then was put into. Because as much as I grew up in Peckham, my school was predominantly, middle upper class kids who had different opportunities, and because you were socialising in those circles, you were then given better opportunities. And then when you're going to university, the arts, like, even arts uni as a whole, the UAE out, it's very like lots of like social parties, and you're socialising and you're networking in a completely different circle in comparison to my friends that I grew up with in Peckham.
It's nepotism, isn't it? It's like you're going to give jobs and opportunities to people you know, who either look like you or you've grown up with and have that connection with. I think that's what it comes down to essentially, is people have difficulties relating to people who don't look like them, and thus opportunities tend to circle around people who all look the same.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is where it stems a lot from education, because even if I look at the teachers that I had in my school, predominantly majority of them are white. And I do believe on role models around you, or people who can inspire you. If you see people who look like you in roles that are seen as, glorified or just simply an element of stability and unlike the concept of struggle, then you believe that it's more likely that you're able to achieve those things. And I think that's what's really important. You need to have actual variation of different races, of all people, not even just race, even like sexuality, everything, just so that you recognise that it's normalised to be able to achieve those things. Because even, for instance, again, I'm going to go back to mum as always, but her being a black teacher, the black kids in other classes were seen as disruptive, but in her class, they weren't disruptive. They listened, they got the highest grades. But why is it that in that class they can not be seen as disruptive and they're treated equal? It's because they see someone who looks like their mum or their aunt, so they're able to relate and recognise that they're not being singled out because of their colour, because the person who's teaching you. Do you know what I mean? It becomes, you need to be able to see yourself within these people who are teaching you, because if you recognise that everyone doesn't look like you, to some degree, if you don't see it, you don't quite believe it, that you're able to achieve bigger and greater things.
Yeah, I think so. It's like, it's hard to imagine a future if there's no examples of it. And I think, but I guess like now I think is quite an exciting time, because we're at a moment where like the landscape of people in positions of power and is changing. It's not completely changing, but I think it is improving, but then I think we're very much aware of that one person or one or two people within an institution. You're still inside that institution.
That's exactly it, because you want to be excited and to praise these small opportunities. Like recently, I won't name names, but I've been
There's not a name. But we still would like to have a working career of our own.
Exactly. But I've been seeing like certain people getting roles, like very high roles in certain positions, whether it's fashion, art, politics, magazines, anything, and you're seeing it, and it's great to see that there are more black heads or like creative directors for certain things, but that fundamentally they're one person I feel like also people are using it's tokenism again. It's like the actual head office is still all predominantly.
It looks exactly the same as it did before.
It's not changing, but in regards to the faces that they're putting up as the creative director or the editor, like the front of house looks diverse, but back of house, the people who are actually not even back of house, the people who are running it are still not diverse. So with that, yes, we have to be thankful and appreciate that there is change. But how much true change is there? We still have to be thankful, yes, but fundamentally, if the head office and the people who are actually in control of what goes where, who does what, when, if they're not changing, then quite frankly, we are just, it's kind of
a puppet.
You're a puppet.
It's a puppet speaking for somebody else. I think we can very much see that with, I guess, in politics here with like Piri Patel. But let's not go too much there.
Maybe it's everything, even when it comes to fashion or politics. Like Barack Obama, everyone assumed that then all of a sudden the world would be a fairer place and Martin Luther King's dream came true.
But then like next week Trump comes along.
Do you know what I mean? Trump comes along and then all of a sudden you're seeing what's happened in 2021 in the first 2 weeks, probably. When did it, like Capitol, when you saw all of the Trump supporters climbing.
I guess
how much change has really happened?
I guess it's not so much change as in just, I guess it's the small thing of being a child and looking at a TV or looking at a magazine and being like, that politician looks like me or talks like me, and so
it gives hope.
It gives hope, and can maybe inspire some people to want to be something that maybe they thought they wouldn't have been able to have done previously.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's a positive thing. I think, of course, with what they say, we're not trying to like move it aside because we're not seeing the change we want. Obviously, you have to still take baby steps before you can change everything altogether. It's not going to happen overnight.
Lots of baby steps. Generations of baby steps.
So I think we, of course, have to be thankful for this change, but I think, unfortunately, the thing that will never, ever disappear is the concept of having to work twice as hard. Because, quite frankly, the systems that are in control of the educational system, politics, everything, it's still fundamentally not as diverse or reflective of this, United Kingdom of diversity. Quite frankly, it's still predominantly very whitewashed, and I think we just have to be quite honest about that, honest and open.
I think also when we talk about the concepts of working twice, 10 times as hard, that we've kind of all had instilled within us from an early age, is how in which we relate to that. It's one thing when it can be a positive thing in terms of it is good to have a good work ethic and to work hard, but there is also the implications of being consumed by the need to work so much harder than other people. It's also the good immigrant kind of perception that you can't take a step wrong, and at the end of the day we are people and we are flawed.
And we're human.
Exactly. So there needs to be space to realise, yes, you want to work hard, but then like it's okay to take a break and like it's not a race. And, yeah.
I'm always being told to take a break. I don't know what a break is. But I think that's the thing as well, though, that what you said is so 100% true. The concept of recognising that you can just pause. But I think we're so used to constantly having to work so hard that if you pause, you feel like you're doing something wrong. Like you're letting down your family, you're letting down legacy, you're letting down generations who have had to work so hard in order for you to be where you are, that you don't want to take it for granted. So the moment you pause, I personally feel like I'm almost like taking for granted the work ethic of my mum or her family or the people who have had to like literally travel Windrush to get here. I feel like because we've got this opportunity to be in this country, as much as yes, there are so many disadvantages that we may face as people, the fact that we're here, it's a blessing. So to take it for granted, I feel like the moment you pause, I think we all have that complex. That's why in my opinion, we have such major issues when it comes to mental health within our community, because we're constantly trying to be able to pay out our mum's mortgage, buy our parents a house so that they're okay. So we're just constantly trying to achieve the next thing, rather than once you've achieved something, you can't even have a moment to appreciate that thing. You're just thinking about, okay, what next? Because if you pause, then you're letting down a family. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it's a huge thing that is detriment. But I think within the black community, the relationship to dealing with mental health is still a process and something that needs to be unpacked in terms of understanding and being empathetic towards. And I think also because you have this kind of you have the tropes of the strong black woman. You're supposed to be strong. You're not supposed to. Do you know what I mean? Like we're taught to work so hard, and you've got to be strong. And I think there is like a shame in needing a break and thinking about like, okay, your career is not going to look how you'd like it to look because you have to take a break. Do you know what I mean? And it happens to people.
I think also that one of the issues with mental health though is the fact that so many people who I know who need therapy, who need like, I'm not saying that in an insult, I'm just saying,
I didn't mean to laugh.
But like, you know, even with me, like I see cancer, I seek therapy, but I think one thing I recognise is whilst I'm exploring different routes of therapy for my own personal reasons, every single therapist I meet is white. I haven't ever come across anybody who looks like me, and I think this is something that causes some slight I don't know, I think that concept of me saying that if you see a teacher who looks like you think that you're able to flourish and do as good as them because you see that as a role model. But I also think when it comes to therapy, there's only so much. You can open up, yes, but there's only so much you feel like these people will truly understand you because your life experience, they cannot relate to. It's completely opposite.
I think, and also you can't explain your. It's like I can see I could never imagine what it's like to be a white man. I can see the lives of white men, but that's never going to be my experience. And at the end of the day, if it is not your lived experience, there is only so much. I think we can all try as much to be empathetic and put ourselves in other people's positions, but you can't. And I think also it comes down to things that people are most passionate and care about things that impact them the most.
Yeah.
It's like there's so many people who will become advocates for something in particular because it has impacted them or their family. I think when you don't have that connection to something, there is a certain level of disconnect, whether you want there to be or not. And I think
that's the issue when it comes to therapy and mental health, because when I've tried to suggest to some friends to try it, they always say it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. But then I have then dealt with people who have then explored like doulas or black therapists, and they are black, and then they've stated that it's actually helped them because they feel more comfortable to explore or talk about their situation because they truly think that therapist will understand. So I think it's a mixture of things though. It's not just necessarily about the therapist having to look like you. I think the concept of sitting down and taking a moment to yourself to actually discuss what is troubling you, even that it's a fear. It's a fear to talk about generational trauma. It's a fear to talk about the race wars that you're seeing that are so blatantly put all over the media. There's so many things that once you actually open up and talk about it, though that's a positive thing, the actual cycle and the process of then actually having to deal with that also is what fears us, I think, the most, because we're constantly day by day having to deal with people who might be crossing the road holding their bags tighter, or people who might be, you know, hearing even things like drill music or grime music. I saw it the other day on BBC News where they made a post talking about drill music is even used up in court. So music which is just a way of expressing yourself.
Despite like rock music mentioning murders.
Exactly. Like the amount of, I'm obsessed with Marilyn Manson, and the amount of stuff which is talking about drugs, I'm going to kill myself. They're not using that in court cases, but anything that is predominantly black, they automatically want to link. Like even there's a recent rapper called D. They made a whole documentary on it on BBC, and they were talking about he's the first musician who's been given I think it's called a CTB ban, which he can't speak about anything related to violence on any of his music. He can't talk about anything violent related, otherwise he can go back to prison. And it's just like even you're controlling creativity
and freedom of speech. Because I know they've had terrorists before speak at like Oxford and Cambridge.
Yeah.
But I guess it's like it's different for different people, isn't it? But what was I going to say? I had a point, but
I think what it comes down to is it's like we always need to recognize that as a community there are so many things that only we can truly understand because we've all lived that experience. And with this concept of working twice as hard, regardless of whether or not it's in educational system or it's within the arts, or if you want to do law or anything academic, even when you're a child up until when you're an adult, you always have that mentality of having to do so, whether or not it's because of your white counterpart. You just are then, it becomes a work ethic. It just becomes natural. But I think we do need to really take a moment to reflect on how that's impacting our mental and our physical state, because there's so many things that you then have that's a continuation or an after effect or repercussions of not looking after your mental, of this constant need to constantly work. As I was saying in our last talk where we could actually have an audience, it's pretty sad that a pandemic has to occur for people to actually take a moment to reflect on what they actually want to do in life or what makes them happy, or reflect on their actual life experience. It shouldn't be that the whole world needs to stop. A lockdown, part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4 needs to occur for us to actually have a moment to reflect on what truly makes us happy. I think that alone is an issue. I think we need to recognise the norm of, yes, you have to work hard, but it shouldn't be so much so that we end up becoming robots and we become lifeless.
And also this constant need to prove yourself, I think, is a dangerous thing, especially to place on children when you're developing. And I think imagine if we had the space to be creative and to learn and to do all these things, but without the thought that if we don't work really, really hard at it, or if we're not like the best in our class, or we have to be better than anybody else to just stand a chance. I think it's almost as if like it can get in your way, wanting something so much and feeling that everything is dependent upon achieving a level of success or a level of financial security, because already, because of race, your position in society has a certain place that I think people end up seeking money and success in order to feel maybe a sense of protection and safety.
Yeah. No, but it's true, because I even know some people currently who are working jobs like that. They've got the academic role. They were meant to be here to talk, but unfortunately it's not quite possible. But even people who go down the academic path, when they work so hard to reach a certain role, but then they end up making themselves physically sick. And then with that, because you're so used to being a part of a certain circle or a certain class or a certain caliber of people, that you work yourself to the grave, like literally, because you're trying to keep up appearances. And I think it's dangerous. I think there's a very thin line between working hard and just simply working yourself to an early grave. I think there's a level that needs to be discussed, I think, as a community and especially as a generation. I think we're quite lucky where what we're able to achieve or what circles we're able to be in. Perhaps our parents or our grandparents weren't able to be in those circles due to the mere fact of trying to keep a roof over your head. But we're given a better level of opportunity that our parents and our grandparents weren't able to have. So I think we should use that, but not then take on board the worry that our grandparents or our parents had. I think that's where we need to be really careful about how we enable the next generation to come in without giving them that fear of letting us down and actually just living their truths. I think that's really important to me personally. Because
this generational pressure that we're creating
It's
for ourselves, essentially.
No, definitely.
I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? When society has told you something for so long that you have to create your own messages and your own defense mechanisms against those, and they become something that is passed down generation after generation. But then, how much are these things still serving us?
If anything, it's just preventing us from moving forward and evolving and doing better, because it's like a wall that's preventing us from going further. But I think the good thing is our generation now are having these talks. If it's not us doing things such as Black Exchange, there are loads of people from different communities who are having these public conversations. I think it's just really important to remember what it's all about and the foundations, which is simply about trying to live our truths and to prevent the generational sort of traumas or pressures to continue on. I think we really need to focus on that and trying to grow as an entire community rather than trying to do the whole, it's good that you and I can have this talk, but then what? I think there's so many people who unfortunately might not have these conversations with their friends because them and their friends, it might be like an unnatural line of competition, so everyone's just trying to climb up to get to the top. But I think what would be great is if people don't try to necessarily flourish only as independents, but actually try to flourish as a community.
I think that's what it comes down to, is like not success for one, but what does collective success look like? And I think also not just appearing successful, because I think that's something that happens to a lot of people. It becomes about appearances and whatnot. And I think when it does come to like wealth, generational wealth, it's about putting the foundations down for the next generation to be able to do better than we can do.
Definitely. I think especially what you said about appearances, I think that's where social media becomes so harmful, because everybody, like me and my cousin were having this talk, and she works in PR, and she was just talking about there's a lot of people in fashion, let's say, who might be who might physically look like, appearances wise,
but they're hungry underneath.
But you don't, you might have a rented bag, or don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to judge, but it comes to a point of if you physically look like you have your shit together, but you can't pay your rent, or have you got savings in your account to try and one day buy a house? Like, it's not about appearances or keeping up with the Jones, as our parents would know of. It's more about, I think we need to really try to implement within our community the concept of, yes, make your money, do as good as you can wherever you can, but also put money into your future. Like, try to own property. There's so few people I know who are people of colour, not just black people of colour in general, who do not necessarily come from families who own assets, because we're constantly trying to work. It's usually like renting, like buying things to keep up with appearances, to look as similar to your neighbours who might have X, Y, and Z. But I think it's not about appearances. We need to think of the foundation so that the next generation don't have to work dead-end jobs that they hate in order to pay their rent. If you can work to be on a certain level that you own a house, and then your children then don't have to have that struggle, I think it's easier said than done, don't get me wrong. But I think social media also does take a big role in putting the pressures on everyone to fit an approved, like even that concept of like you're certified by Instagram, you get a tick that says you're a certified human being. Like, what makes you certified? The fact that you have X, Y amount of followers, or this amount of likes. I think we shouldn't be trying to chase that, but I think with the community that, as a community that we are currently, in the generation that we're in currently, I think people are more focused on appearances rather than the knowledge that we're learning to be able to share with others.
I think that's the thing. I think, and even as much as we mentioned like generational wealth and stuff, I think educational wealth is probably the greatest wealth that like we can have, and I think it's also thinking about how in which barriers are stopping young children from being able to develop and get the education they need in order to start a future. And I think it comes down to learning about our own history, and just as much as being able to see physical examples of success within the Black community can help you envisage your own success, but also I lost my tangent.
I get what you mean in regards to the fact that at the end of the day, education is key, and we need to try to always bring back that focus. But I do also, I'm very torn when it comes to education, because of course it's key and it's our foundations at the end of the day that enable us to go so far. But I do think this entrepreneurship, that method really needs to be.
I don't necessarily, when I say education, I don't just mean within traditional institutions. And I actually, what I was going to say was in terms of education, in terms of Black history, and knowing positive things about our history, and which also can help you know that you can achieve, because there's so much great things that have been done throughout history. Do you know what I mean? Like, we're only taught post-slavery.
But I saw a quote about slavery in regards to people need to stop seeing slavery as Black history. It's not. It just paused our history.
Exactly. It's a moment. It was a moment.
But what happened prior to that? Like, people, even when we were having the talks of Black Exchange, when I was saying things such as like the first university was in Mali. Like, people always assume that if you're of African descent that you're uneducated and you come from struggle. No, universities began in Africa. The fact that all of the books, the libraries, books were originated in Mali. Like, these things, when I was learning, I was blown away.
And also, I think we're putting so much weight and what's the word, gravitas to institutions, and do they even have all of this knowledge? Like, I've heard of big universities not having teachers who can teach about African history or I think it's yes, they have a certain amount of knowledge, but maybe these institutions are not all the be all and end all, and it's how in which knowledge can be shared, because also there is also barriers already put in place. We have the fees went up in terms of university fees. There's so many barriers put in place of people getting an education. And then once you get into that education, what do they even give you? Like, for me at art school, I don't know what I paid for, in all honesty, to sit in a room with a tutor once a week. Do you know? Yeah, barely. This is what I mean, and you're working all your way towards this one thing, and then you get there and you're like,
just wasted a lot of money.
So what am I getting out of it? And then they tell you, oh, you need to do some internships now.
Unpaid internships.
Yeah, exactly. It's
no, it's true, 100%. I think one thing what you mentioned about universities, yes, don't get me wrong, we're not trying to slate that route, but even, for instance, I think when the pandemic and lockdowns happened, Zooms were becoming everything. Like, we all do everything through Zoom now. And so many things that we learned through Black history studies, and things we learned about Black history were all through these independent Zooms meetings. And it was like you were basically learning about Black history courses through Zoom. And what I learned during 2 Zooms that we attended,
a couple of free Zooms. It's more than you learn.
Have to pay for it, but it's the more I learned about Black history was on those free Zooms than I did in the school I went to. And I went to Haberdasher Ass, which is one of the best schools in England. And all we learned about Black history was Rosa Parks, who was too tired, she didn't want to get up off the bus, even though the fact is she was working in Black civil rights politics before she decided to take that seat. And Martin Luther King. But the history that I learned about Mali, about Benin, like the Agoji warriors, about like Maasai, like all of these things that we were learning, even like with medical apartheid, I had no idea. I had touched base on it because of my mother, but that's because she was educated enough to be able to pass that down. But these things that we're discovering now, that's all through Zoom. So yes, the educational system, going to school, university, they are things that, you know, you get praised for. But I do genuinely feel like you can learn so much from other sources, and I think we need to be able to share those sources and find a way to have more access to that, rather than putting pressure on people to go into thousands of pounds of debt just to be taught a skill that you could predominantly learn in an internship.
Well, yeah, I think unless it's something so specific like being a doctor,
Yeah,
or,
of course. Yeah,
but like,
level.
yeah, but I think, you know, there are so many things like art or like English literature, these kinds of things, like you can learn yourself and you can learn from others. But I think it's also, I think we have to remember with these institutions is they are teaching us as much as they want us to know.
Of course.
So there's a
purpose.
reason why certain things are left out of the curriculum.
It's about control at the end of the day. I think that's, as a nation, as the human race, there has to always be a level of control.
An order.
You have to know where you stand. You have the government, and then you have the hierarchy, and then you have classism, and there's a level of order that it needs to stay this way in order for Great Britain to be great. So I think that's not just even Britain in general, that's just the world. And I think for me, now I'm 29, I'm looking at the educational system just even more like shocked and flabbergasted by the fact that how is it that the key stage books that I was taught is the same that my younger cousin's being taught? Like, how is it that the books aren't changing? You're learning about World War II. Winston Churchill was supposedly so great, but yet you also forget to leave out the fact that he was a huge racist. You have Hitler. It's the same history. And as years go by, history is changing. But yeah, that's not being it's being documented by the younger generation. It's being documented. But when it comes to the actual books that the kids are taught, it's still the same.
I think essentially it's that they don't want people to question.
And if you do, you're seen as disruptive.
And it's about control. I think from a very early age, they're teaching you how much to move within society.
I think that's the thing. I think it's very important that the youth understand that, you know, I think now we see that even more so, like even when it comes to human rights and politics, there's a lot of young youth who are opening the older generation's eyes and shouting for what they believe in, which I totally respect. Because even in our parents' day, they were doing protests left, right, hand and centre. It's only when the Black Lives Matter movement again came up last summer that people were seeing how powerful and impactful protests can be. But even then, how much change happens?
Because
you know?
because we've been protesting for years and generations have been protesting. It's not something new. I guess it's like you make like tiny little bits of progress, and I think sometimes it can overtly look like a lot more progress has been made than the reality, especially when it comes down to things like law and stuff. Like, you know, it's like it comes down to the small print. In the small print, not much has actually changed.
Yeah,
But
that's true.
public facing will make it look like things have changed.
But we've just been given a question, and somebody's asked, does anyone know any black historians? The one that I know of mainly is Robin Walker. That's there are obviously many others, but Robin Walker's the main person that I know of. And with him, he always talks a lot. He's got a book called Before We Were Slaves, and that's the main book that a lot of people such as Akala and other people have learned from, because he always speaks about the history before slavery. So you get to learn about like I said, Ogoji warriors, Benin kings and queens, and universities, and important information that we're simply not taught in educational system that we have now. So Robin Walker is the main person that I know of, but you were going to say.
There's David, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his surname correctly, David Olugosa, who he's done a lot about Black British history, and he also did a few documentaries on the BBC which are more accessible, easily accessible information in terms of Black history. And then I've got like quite a thick Black history book, Black British history book that he's wrote that's really interesting, but it is quite an intense. I think also, yeah, I think it's also, it can be intense when you're learning about history, our history, because a lot of it is hard to hear. So
it's also, some of it is amazing to hear. Like when you discover, for me it was Ogoji warriors. I was so obsessed with them because they're basically the film Black Panther. The women all were skinheads, and they were actually based on Benin Ogoji warriors. And for me, obviously, I had a skinhead for how many years? So I was just like, I was so excited by it. But the women were because obviously now in the 21st century, it's always men who are in war and soldiers. But in Africa, in Benin times, in Ogoji warriors, the women were the ones who were on front line, so they were protecting the king, and they would actually dig holes into the ground to be able to hide away from who they were fighting. So I think things like that, discovering powerful women in history such as that, was incredible. But really the only one I've read about a lot is Robin Walker. I know of the one that you mentioned because it has lots of documentaries on BBC iPlayer. I think they're still on there, actually.
Yeah, I think they're still accessible.
But there's so many other books. I think what we need to do in regards to like our social media, like our Instagram, obviously it's 2021, so I think we might have to like clear the grid line and work on the website. But I think we definitely will put all of the links to all of the Black historians that we have. But I think we've got a list. Have that already. On
our website there is some suggested books and YouTube videos and stuff online to watch. So if you check out on the website, there are some resources there, but we'll be continually adding to them. 2021.
But I think overall, because I know that these always cut out after a certain amount of time, it may cut out any minute now. But to summarise, I think when it comes to the concept of working twice as hard, I think now it's about finding the balance and recognising, yes, we have a work ethic that has become generational and it's passed down, but we need to make sure that we're focusing on our mental health with that. There's no harm in knowing that the work ethic has to be great in order to create legacy and to feed into the drive that our parents once had. But I do think we need to recognise there needs to be an element of balance and focusing on that, because it's all going to well us working 100 times as hard, but if our mental isn't stable, then that's where as a community if as a community you're all unwell mentally, what generations or legacy are you going to be?
Exactly. And I think it's like, and I think people have to question what they're working hard for, because I think it's all very well working hard for your children, but if you don't see or speak to your children that much because you're busy working so hard, so I think it's hard. It's hard because it's difficult in England being able to survive and like never mind thrive, but that is the goal. That is the goal.
100%. Okay, should we wrap it up? Okay, well, we're going to be doing future projects and we'll be announcing that, because we have been able to use the GoFundMe money that we built. Last summer we did United Against Oppression, and we've been able to actually use that money and give it to all of the charities. So that's something they want to thank, because that was amazing. And we also have our own Black Exchange Fund that's there, and we've managed to raise some money for that. So we definitely, hopefully, when COVID decides to relax a bit, be able to actually use those finances to hopefully do an exhibition and to bring the community back together again.
Because that's what it was all about when we started. It was about having these conversations and creating community through these conversations. Because as much as it's great us two having these conversations, but it's bigger than us.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's definitely the focus. And once we have the all clear to go ahead with those community projects, we'll definitely be doing that and introducing more people to join. So thank you.
Thank you.